As we come to look at this passage on page 63, we're going to be focusing in on verses 18 through 31 of chapter 22. You'll see that we read verses 16 and 17. Verse 16 begins with, if a man seduces, and then it goes on to say what he shall do. And you might notice that that fits in with all the other wording of the other verses in chapter 22 going backwards. So chapter 22 begins with, if a man steals, then he must do that, verse 1. If a man, verse 5, causes a field or vineyard, blah, 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 he must do something. Verse 7, if a man. Verse 10, if a man. Verse 14, if a man. So I hope you can see in a way that there's a good reason why verse 16 and 17 should actually fit into that earlier section, because it also begins with if a man. If you look at verse 18, it begins with you shall not. Quite a clear command, and it goes on down. Look at verse 28, you shall not. Verse 29, you shall not. Look at the sentence that starts with the big 23, you shall not. And that will carry on through the book of the covenant till chapter 23, verse 19. It will still be saying you shall not be doing there. So I hope you can see there's a bit of a change between what we would say if a man, he shall. That's kind of like almost example judgments that you can use in the law court to base your future judgments on. And then we now come in verse 18 through 31 to direct commands to the covenant people about how they should live. So both are dealing with how the covenant people should live, but they are slightly different. For that reason, that's a long way of saying we're not going to look at verse 16 and 17 this morning. We will come back and do a separate sermon on that, hopefully. But in order just to keep the focus this morning, we're going to look at verses 18 through 31. And therefore, the title to our sermon is Covenant Loyalty. Covenant loyalty. What did it look like for Israel to be loyal to their covenant God? And that's an important question for you and me this morning, because the church, if you're trusting in Jesus Christ, then you're part of God's covenant people now. What does it look like for you and for me to have covenant loyalty to God here right now in the 21st century? And one of the big things it means is devotion to the Lord, a heart of devotion to the Lord. And there's a statement there in verse 31 that kind of stands out, because God says very clearly, you shall be consecrated to me. You shall be devoted to me. Devoted in your heart, and out of that devotion to me will flow a pure life, and a life that is kind of set apart and different, set apart unto God. So you will have that devotion towards me if you are God's covenant people. So as we begin to think about Israel's covenant devotion to the Lord, we see that God begins this section here with some non-negotiables of relationship. If they're going to be devoted, if they're going to be his people, and he is going to be their God, there are some covenant non-negotiables that he launches into in verse 18, 19, and 20. And so we're going to look at 3 items under this heading of covenant non-negotiables. And the first one is exclusive worship to Yahweh, exclusive worship. 18 and 19 and 20, those verses, they come as a unit together. And verse 20 is the climax of this little unit. And so we read here, whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. They shall be put to death. Israel's worship is to be of the Lord alone. That's the exclusivity. They are not to replace him, add to him, take away from him, or rename him. They are to worship him as he has revealed himself to them. If they fail to worship the Lord as he has revealed himself to them, they will stop being God's covenant people. So covenant loyalty is to worship God in truth and to worship him only. But if Israel is to show covenant loyalty, they will also need to show exclusive trust exclusive trust. And we see that in verse 18 of this little unit. He says, you shall not permit a sorceress to live. What was a sorceress or a sorcerer? Well, it was one who by magic reached out to spiritual powers other than the Lord. And people came to sorcerers to seek solutions in their lives. And sorcerers were common in Egypt, and they were common in Canaan. But they were not to exist in Israel. They would turn the people's trust away from God. Now in verse 18, why does it say sorceresses? Why does it use the feminine noun for that? Well, most likely it was because this area of magic was probably dominated by women at this time. And this is why sorceress is used here. But we are not to understand that this command was simply speaking to them. It would have included both male and female sorcerers. And they were not to live in the land of Israel. So for Israel, covenant loyalty meant exclusively trusting in the Lord, always and only turning to him for guidance and help. If Israel begins to seek other powers for help and guidance, and she allows that practice to spread in the nation, she will stop being God's covenant people. So exclusive worship of the Lord is non-negotiable. Exclusive trust in the Lord is non-negotiable. And exclusive submission to the Lord is non-negotiable also. And so we read in verse 19, whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. And the phrase there, lies with, is a sexual statement. And notice this command in verse 19 is placed between two commands that carry a strong sense of worship. So why is this command placed here between these commands of worship? Well, if Israel is to show covenant loyalty, they need to be willing to submit to God not only as their Savior and Redeemer out of Egypt, but as their Creator. They must be willing to submit to what He has made them, willing to submit to the boundaries He has placed on them for their good. For a person to lie with an animal is to cross one of the great creation boundaries given to mankind. God made humans for sexual relationships between one man and one woman within marriage. And verse 19 reveals one of the most extreme violations of this God-given boundary. And God is saying to Israel, you can't claim to worship me and trust me if you don't accept my created boundaries for you. So we need to understand this morning, sex outside marriage violates God's creation boundaries. Sex between the same sex violates God's creation boundaries. Declaring your own gender violates God's creation boundaries. And you can't rebel against your Creator's boundaries and still worship Him. So I plead with you this morning, if that is you, turn from your rebellion and live. Many, many people have turned from such rebellion and lived. To push on down this road of rebellion is death. There is no life there. But there is another challenge from these opening verses. You know, at HCC, we rightly place a big importance on worshiping our God in spirit and in truth. We don't want to add to His revelation of Himself, and we don't want to take away from His revelation of Himself. We want our worship to be exclusive to the Lord. But do we trust Him? In our daily lives, to whom or to what are we reaching out? When confusing and difficult situations happen, do we reach out for the Lord or for some other power? Do we reach for our God or for a sorcerer of some sort? For example, finances are essential. Money is essential to life, in a way. But are we reaching for our finances first? Is our trust in them? The biological family is a great blessing. But are we trusting in them above trusting in the Lord? Do we go to them before we go to the Lord? You know, the world offers us so many powers to reach out for. But God's loyal covenant people, they reach out for him first. It is good to have our theology of our God deep and true. That is good. But it needs to be matched by an exclusive trust in him in all situations. So those are serious things, dear brothers and sisters. These three commands that come together, they're non-negotiable. Feel the force of them in verse 18. God says, you shall not permit. They're not to happen. And each one is accompanied by the warning of death. That was a physical death, but there is spiritual death for us. So let us together encourage one another in exclusive worship, exclusive trust, and exclusive submission to our God. This is covenant loyalty. So in verses 18 through 20, we've been applying the 10 Commandments, and we've really been applying the first 3 of those 10 Commandments. You shall have no gods except me. You shall make no idols. You shall honor my name. And that same kind of applying of those first 3 commandments continues in verses 28 through 31. And so we'll go there. We'll continue that theme of considering our relationship towards God as covenant people. And what do we see in this passage? Well, we see, again, a call to wholehearted devotion. And along with that wholehearted devotion, it shows itself in quickness and completeness of response. So look at verse 29. It says, you shall not delay to offer. There's the quickness. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness. There's the completeness of your harvest. So the fullness of harvest was the first and the best of the harvest. And the harvest here is thinking of the grain and the wheat and the corn. These were all to come without delay to God. And they were also to give of the outflow of their presses. That's speaking of the wine and the oil that would come from the grape and from the olive that would be pressed. And that's to come to God. And they're not to hold back on their firstborn of their sons. They're to be given. And of course, when they get to the land, the Levites will stand in place of the firstborn son. They could be redeemed in other ways. And even some of the animals, firstborn animals, could be redeemed and kind of brought back. Or they had to be sacrificed. But bringing the firstborns to God, that would have reminded Israel very clearly of his compassion to them. And compassion is a theme of the passage that we're looking at. We're looking at a compassionate God. And we're going to see that that's why we're called to compassion. And they would have been reminded in bringing their firstborn of how God had shown them compassion down in Egypt when he struck the firstborn throughout the whole of Egypt. But he spared Israel's firstborns, animals and sons. And he brought them out mightily. And so, Israel, in devotion and love and appreciation of God's compassion, are to bring these offerings quickly and completely. And look at verse 30. They're to do it on the 8th day. So for 7 days, those animals can remain with the mother, but on the 8th, they are to be brought. It reminds us maybe of circumcision for the Israelite boys, where they would wait 7 days, and on the 8th day, they would be brought to God. And so there's this sense that this is the right day for dedication. This is the day to acknowledge God with all that you have. Come on the 8th day, but don't delay. Don't come on the 9th. Don't come on the 10th. Don't hold back your possessions. Don't hold back your heart. Come with devotion. May it be quick and full. And this devotion, this covenant loyalty, is not only for the big events of their lives, like the public offerings we just looked at, but it's for the small events, the unseen events. Israel's devotion is to be 24/7. Look at verse 31, where we read, "You shall be consecrated to me. You shall be devoted to me." That's such a big statement. It permeates the whole of the book of the covenant. And you might think that with such a big statement, when he says, therefore, you might expect a very big, big event. And it says, you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beasts in the field. It's a small event in a way. It's an everyday event. We've looked at those big events of offerings. We've looked at the big events of worship at the altar. But he doesn't bring our attention to that. He brings it to a small event. And God is doing that on purpose because he is saying, listen, your devotion to me is to be found not only in the big events, but the small events. The daily events of life. So on Sunday, it's good that we gather. And I trust and I pray, may we cry out every day, Lord, when we come and gather, may I be quick in my heart. May I be full in my heart in my praise to you. Yes, let that be true. Let it be so. We can examine our hearts as how's it's been this morning. But on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, please, Lord, may my devotion be seen in the small things as well. So what about when you suddenly meet a carcass in the field, we might say? Because look at that verse 31. He's given us quite a helpful image there in verse 31, where a man walks in the field and what he finds actually is it would have been a clean animal. He would have been able to eat it, but it's been attacked by an animal. And so it's been torn by an unclean animal. So it's no longer clean. And there it is right before him. And no one's around. Surely he could pick it up and take it home. Maybe his family is hungry. Maybe they haven't eaten in a while. This would carry them through for 2 weeks, maybe. What does he do? When no one to watch. And he says, no, I won't. I won't do it. I'm in covenant with my God. I want to stay clean. I'm devoted to him. Well, that's the picture. But what about you and me in the small things? When maybe we come across a carcass in the field on our laptop, if I can use that expression, a website that is unclean. Do we declare we're in covenant with our God? Does our covenant loyalty show itself at that moment when no one is around? Or when on that same laptop we are tempted to buy something we don't need? Are we quick to click, buy? But are we slow to bring our money to God? Money that he has given us. What do we do with that wage that we receive? Is it to bring the first and best to God? Or is it to delay and then see if it is used up on other things that we don't need? So dear brothers and sisters, how we are showing our covenant loyalty matters. So we thought about Israel's covenant loyalty towards God. In verses 21 through 27, let's just think about our covenant loyalty as God says it should be towards one another. And so we begin to see that in verses 21 through 27, it's applying the last 5 commandments of the 10 commandments. Those ones that kind of speak of, that are summed up in love your neighbor as yourself. That's the kind of idea that's going on here. As we turn to a horizontal view, how does God expect our covenant loyalty to show itself there? And the main point is that justice and compassion toward the vulnerable should be seen as part of our covenant loyalty. That's the point. Yes, we should show compassion and we should show justice to everyone. But there is an aspect where God, our God, has a kind of soft spot for the vulnerable. And so he's looking to you and me to show that similar kind of compassion and justice to them. And so we ask the question, do we love justice and compassion for the vulnerable like our God does? That's a very big challenge to me. And I have to say, no, I don't. My compassion isn't there. So I need to change. I need to get in step with the picture that God gives here of his compassion and how he expects us to have compassion. And so what are the vulnerable people that we see here? Well, there's 4 different types of vulnerable people. The first one we see in verse 21 is what's called the sojourner. So that's a resident foreigner, someone who is living in the land, but they are a foreigner. They're seeking to live and survive in Israel. And why are they vulnerable? Well, they're vulnerable because they don't have any land. Remember, when God gives the land of Canaan to Israel, he will give the land as an inheritance to all the tribes. Israel will own it. Anyone coming in will not own land. And when they arrive, they won't have family. They certainly won't have extended family. And they'll have no history in the land to build on. And that makes them vulnerable. And so God says in verse 21, you shall not wrong them. You shall not oppress them. That's a call for not only justice, but compassion. That's what should happen. And in verse 22, he brings in 2 other vulnerable sets of people, the widow and the fatherless child. And both are vulnerable because they've lost either the husband or the dad. That one figure in their life who provided immediate protection, who provided for their needs. He is suddenly taken away. And if the extended family, if they don't show them compassion and if they don't show them justice, then they will be in a very vulnerable position. And God says, you shall not mistreat them. You shall not mistreat them. And the 4th group is the indebted poor of Israel. Verse 25. And why are they vulnerable? Well, they have virtually nothing. They are living on the edge of existence, and they have to take out a loan. It's not a loan to get something that they would like or prefer. No, this is a loan to survive. And God says, you shall not mistreat them either. You shall show them compassion and justice. Let's look at those verses just a bit more closely. He says, if you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor. So God doesn't say that either lending or borrowing is necessarily wrong. He says, look, if you do it, you shall not be like the money lender to him. And you shall not exact interest from him. So he says, listen, in covenant with people, in the covenant people, there shall be no interest charged. You shall not approach this in a calculated kind of way, which says, how can I get back what I've given? But you shall approach it in a compassionate way. And you won't charge any interest. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't necessarily anticipate that the loan itself would not come back to you. Look at verse 26. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge. So it was okay to take a kind of security, a pledge from the person who had taken the loan. They would give you something of value, and it would remind them that they owed the money, and it would be a kind of security for you. But God says, you shall return it to him before sundown if it is his cloak. If he's so poor that the valuable thing that he's got left is the very cloak that he wears in the day and sleeps in, then in compassion at night you will give it back to him. Compassion will flavor what goes on. And listen to God's tone here. He says in verse 27, for that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? Do you hear God's compassionate tone? If he cries out to me, I will hear it, for I am compassionate. Let's look at 2 reasons why Israel is to be compassionate toward the vulnerable. And the first reason is that what's done against the vulnerable is done against God. Now, I know that in one way, all sin that we do is done against God. Ultimately, when we sin against people, we sin against God. But as we're saying, there is a kind of special aspect where God says about the vulnerable, if you think you can sin against them with impunity, think again. You are sinning against me in a special kind of way. Look at what he says he will do in verse 23. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry and my wrath will burn. And I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. There is a sense in which whatever is done to the vulnerable is done against God. I don't know if you can ever remember being a young child and traveling in the back of a car, and you're big enough and strong enough to push your foot quite firmly into the back of the seat in front. And eventually, the parent in the front maybe says, stop that. You're kicking my back. And you kind of awkwardly say, I'm kicking the seat. And they say, no, I'm feeling it in my back. That is what God is saying. If you withhold justice from the vulnerable, if you withhold compassion, you are kicking me. And if they cry to me, I will hear. So do we see our attitude towards the vulnerable and our treatment of the vulnerable through this lens? That mistreatment of the vulnerable is against God. If we do, how might it reshape our behavior this week? I'm speaking to myself. I know I need to make changes to come in line with this character of God. Now, of course, we've been given a list of 4 different types of people that sum up vulnerability. As we look at our community and the United Kingdom, we will have to assess what vulnerability looks like here. And ultimately, you have to kind of engage people on an individual level to discover where their vulnerability truly lies. But what we need to have happening is that our heart towards people needs to be shaped by this call to compassion and justice. The second reason why Israel is to be compassionate towards the vulnerable is simply that God is compassionate. It is his nature to be compassionate. We've been thinking about it. Verse 27, he says, for I am compassionate. This is the main reason why God demands Israel to be compassionate. And notice, God's compassion leads to a burning anger when he sees justice obstructed. Look back at verse 23 again. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry and my wrath will burn. You see, God's anger and compassion are not in conflict within him. They are not flowing from different compartments of God. They flow harmoniously from the same perfect nature. His compassion produces his anger in this situation. So maybe you imagine an ambulance driving down the clear road. And you can say, that the ambulance is being driven along this clear road by compassion. Compassion draws it towards the vulnerable. And what happens when that ambulance encounters obstacles to the vulnerable? What does it do? It sounds its horns. It puts on its sirens. That's what compassion does. Compassion makes a noise. When it sees justice being obstructed, then compassion can become angry. And God's compassion does. And God says to his covenant people, I am compassionate. It's in my nature. And so today, God's church is covenant people. We are to show this same compassion. And we're to show it because God is compassionate. If we say, listen, I'm in his covenant people, then we want to be like him. We want to be like our Father. And we show it because we have received this compassion from him. If you are a Christian, you have received immense compassion and mercy and kindness from God. And he reminds the Israelites of this in verse 21. Did you see that? He says, you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You were enslaved. You were vulnerable until I came to you. And I delivered you. I showed you compassion. I brought you out. Israel can look back to Egypt and see compassion. The church looks back to the cross and we see compassion. We see our God's kindness and mercy towards us, even though we didn't deserve it. And we say, I want to be like you, God. Help me. And so we see an important principle for us as Christians. Our loyalty, our covenant behavior doesn't flow from a set of rules. We don't behave like we do because there are rules in that regard. We don't behave in good ways because it's charitable and nice. No, we behave like we behave because we want to be like our God. God is that way. And so because of who God is and what he has done, we pursue justice and compassion for the vulnerable. And when we take time, and it will take time, to show compassion to the vulnerable, it isn't wasted time. It's not wasted. It might take a lot of time, but it's not wasted time. You know, I was walking along the canal just the other day, and I saw a little boy sitting on the edge of the canal. There he was, right on the edge of the canal, just sitting there. Was that wasted time? Was it wasted time? Well, you know what? Right next to him was his dad, and they were fishing together. Was it wasted time? No, he was with his dad. He could have been there for hours. It wasn't wasted time. And when we step towards the vulnerable and we waste time, it's not wasted time. Because our God is there. That's what he does. But maybe you are sitting here this morning and you say, I am vulnerable. I am vulnerable. And maybe you say, God hasn't shown up for me. Well, I'm sorry if that's just your situation, if that's how you feel. But may I ask you, have you cried out to him? Have you cried out to him? Did you see that all-important thing? Look at verse 23. If you do mistreat them, and if they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. Look at verse 27 at the end. And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. Have you cried out? Have you cried out to him alone? Have you reached out to him only? Have you laid it out before God? Help me. I am vulnerable. I am oppressed. How do you know his compassion will reach to you? How do you know? Well, you look at the cross where it's already reached down to the point of the Son of God giving his life on the cross. God's compassion, it will reach you. He says, I will hear. May we call out to him and may we follow him. Amen.